Anjee Davis is the president of Fight CRC. She will talk to us a little bit about colorectal cancer. She's used Komodo's data to directly work with the CDC to highlight how the COVID pandemic has left massive gaps in care around screening that makes us find patients later with larger disease burden, and those patients have poorer outcomes. Next, we have Stacie Lindsey. She is a familiar face for the folks who have been here for a couple of years. She was at our last Komodo week. She is the first patient advocacy partner that we ever worked with, which is part of the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. What's incredibly inspiring from last year was the story of her brother and how she went from someone who was just watching the care system to somebody who was changing the care system for the better in cholangiocarcinoma. Lastly, I'm joined by Stacie Hurt, who is an influential patient engagement consultant, healthcare advocate, and survivorship activist. Her story also starts in healthcare over 20 years ago, where she was a healthcare executive. In the midst of that story, her son was diagnosed with a rare disease, and soon after, she found that she had stage 4 colorectal cancer. And so with that, I want to take their cumulative voices today and share with you more around what the story of our patients are and how we can build a better future for patients in a patient-centric healthcare system. And so with that, I'm actually going to start off with the first question, and this one goes to Anjee. Can you share a little bit with us around how you got involved in the work that you do today and what keeps you going?
So that's a great question. So I actually started as an accidental clinical trials coordinator and managed clinical trials for a community clinic, and then joined a university setting. But Fight Colorectal Cancer was founded by a patient advocate 15 years ago. Her mother-in-law was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, and at the time, there was no voice for colorectal cancer patients. There wasn't a voice in Washington, D.C. There weren't support groups. There were listservs, but Facebook wasn't around, Instagram wasn't around, Twitter was just incubating in somebody's mind. And so she really felt like there needed to be a community for colorectal cancer patients to talk about it, to push for legislative action and policy change. And I will say the reason why I stay in this is because of the patients and the families, because they're going through some of the hardest things in their lives, and our job is to carry them when they can't do what they need to do, and we support them, encourage them, share their stories, and remind people there's very serious urgency behind these diseases.
Stacie, Lindsey, do you want to share a little bit more?
Sure. My journey into advocacy was because of my 38-year-old brother who was diagnosed in 2005. He was a marathon runner, he was a lawyer, he was a serial entrepreneur, and his wife was just about to give birth to their 4th child. So he was diagnosed with stage 4 terminal cholangiocarcinoma. And when he told us, it was shocking. And he didn't look sick. He wasn't behaving like a sick person, and he was telling us he had a few months to live. So we just went to work. We just split up the work, and we just started. And the medical pathway was kind of my work. What was he going to do? What was out there? And there was nothing. There was no standard of care. There were no clinical trials. Had been 4, but they had not moved forward because of lack of accrual. There was nothing on the website, on the web at all, nothing. A couple of articles on PubMed, and so I just looked at the names at the bottom of those articles and started contacting people. And that's how we started. My brother lived about 16 months, so the end of 2006, he just said to me when he finished his last treatment, there were no other options. He just said, Stacie, what are you going to do with all these relationships and all these people? We started a little discussion board. I know no one remembers what a discussion board was, but remember it's 2006, 2005. So, and he said, what are you going to do with all the resources that you've gathered? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, you need to do something to help these patients that will come after me, because they won't have, they might not have families like ours they may not have the support. And so that's how the Cholangiocarcinoma foundation was born. But I agree with Anjee, the reason that we keep going and the spark for all of this is the patients, to listen to their stories and hear. COVID was hard on everyone, but it was pretty good for cholangiocarcinoma. We had our first 3 FDA approvals. Never had an FDA approval before. We're getting a new standard of care that was just announced. Well, it's hopefully coming. But this is big news for patients. We did a lot of work during that time, so the patients keep us going.
And last but not least, Stacie, I know you have a story to share as well.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. And thanks for the work you do, number one. My journey into advocacy started probably with, as Aswin introduced me, working in healthcare. And I worked across physician practice management and operations, setting up large management service organizations, working with physicians. Then I carried the bag as a drug rep for 10 years and was in training and development. And then I went to a small pharma company and headed up training and development and working and marketing for them. So if my life wasn't disrupted twice, I would probably be where you're sitting right now. But unfortunately, in 2005, my younger son was born. In 2006, he was diagnosed with a very rare chromosome abnormality, so rare that his syndrome doesn't have a name. He's 16 now. He doesn't walk, talk, or do anything for himself. I have to lift him, diaper him, toilet him, give him medications several times a day. And it's a full-time, it's the best full-time job that I never asked for. And he's nonverbal, but he looks at me with his big blue eyes, and I know that he knows how much I love him. And so as we were getting his diagnosis, and I worked in healthcare, and my husband worked in healthcare, there was no playbook, and there was no way to know what was going on. And my husband and I repeatedly said, if we don't know what's going on, and we work in healthcare, what does everybody else do? Like, what do these people who don't have the knowledge to navigate the system, what do they do? And so we sort of got things squared away with his care. I went back to work, and then in 2014, I was diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer, 27 places across my body, rectum, liver, lungs, lymph nodes, and I was given an 8% chance of survival. And every time I looked in the other room and I saw my son with my husband being diapered and fed and everything, I said, I got to survive. I got to get through this. And I just got to 6 years cancer-free. So personally for me, when I look back at the culmination of that journey through working in healthcare, my son's diagnosis and my diagnosis, similar to my colleagues here, you say, I have to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. I need to tell their stories. I need to help them and get them the care. I am white, privileged, able to access care. So many people can't. And that's why we're here, and that's why I do the work I do.
Stacie, you've seen a lot as it pertains to your son's care and your own care. Can you tell us a little bit around what you think the role of data, technologies, and some of the kind of blossoming new capabilities that you see, what is that role? How does it shape the patient journey?
Yeah. No, I mean, what you all do is so incredibly important because I have made literally life and death decisions based on data that I had. So the integrity of that data, the accuracy of that data, literally led me to pivotal treatment decisions for my son and for myself. So I know some of you are out there, maybe writing code or looking through compliance manuals or writing regulatory requirements, and all of that ends up with a patient or a caregiver or an advocacy leader. we depend on that data for really to pave the rest of our journey. And so we're only as good as the information that we have. And so, and where I see it going, data's where it's at. I do a lot of work through with HIMSS as a digital influencer, and I'm increasingly seeing patients are more involved in their care now more than ever. 89% of patients are going to the internet to self-diagnose before they go to their doctor. So they're going out there to look for answers themselves. And as Stacie said, sometimes paving a way in a rare disease that's never been seen before. So what you put out there is consumable and important.
Next question is for Stacie, Lindsey. When there's about 8,000 patients every year that are diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma, oftentimes the symptoms go unnoticed. Testing, there's a lot of folks out there, providers, who've never even seen a cholangiocarcinoma patient before. So can you tell us a little bit around where the care standards were when this journey first started for you, where they are now, and a little bit around the in-between, around how you're using data, technology, digital, in order to drive education and also understanding around better care standards?
Sure. I apologize, Stacie kind of wrecked me. But it's so good to hear these emotional stories because you want passion in your work. You want to feel like the work that you're doing is meaningful, and hearing these patient stories is the way that you do that. I think it's a step-by-step process, and I've often said that one of the biggest difficulties in advocacy is interpreting or being able to speak multiple languages. You're speaking to the patients, you're speaking to the physicians, you're speaking to the scientists, you're speaking data, you're speaking to regulatory bodies. It's hard to learn all of these languages, and I think it's a step-by-step process. For us, the very first thing that we wanted to do, well, there were a couple of things we wanted to do with Komodo. One was we wanted to understand the real incidence and prevalence of the disease. So the SEER data, and most of you know that's kind of an average for the country taken from some big hospital systems. And everybody knows that that data is not correct, we all know that, but that's the data that's quoted. And we wanted to know what the real incidence, and so we've been working with the Komodo team and working with our scientific and medical advisory board to find out what the real incidence and prevalence is. So say 8,000 new diagnoses a year, and the poll from Komodo with several iterations was about 20,000 per year. So you imagine if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're looking at rare disease, your ROI, right? You have to look at these in a very different way. There's a big difference between 8,000 newly diagnosed patients and 20,000 newly diagnosed patients when you're looking at accrual for a clinical trial or things like that. So that was one of the first things that we wanted to do, was look at what the more realistic numbers looked like for this patient community. The second thing was, one of the number one things that we were, questions that we were spending time with patients on was, where are the specialists? And so the Komodo map, our IT person designed a map of the United States, and then the Komodo data feeds into that, and any patient can go in there and look at all the different specialists from the different disciplinary groups. Super, super helpful. And also having an objective way for us to say who the specialists are, rather than the doctors telling us that they're specialists and us getting into a little trouble. It gives us a little distance from that, so it's been very helpful. That's one of the most highly trafficked sites on our website. And for us, it's been nice to be able to gift that to other nonprofits as well, so that they can take the Komodo data and use that, and their patients can find. I think the number one thing patients want is they want to see a specialist immediately, and that's the Komodo data has allowed us to help them do that. So,
thank you, Anjee. Question for you. I know you work heavily on the policy side, and you're convening a large conference in DC. And you just published a report around Path to a Cure. Can you tell us a little bit around what is the role of patient advocacy as it relates to policy changes, especially for a larger disease area like colorectal cancer?
Sure. I'll take a quick step back because I want to sort of point out Sharon Worrell, who's here, really brought Komodo to us through Stacie. We learned a lot about like what Komodo was doing. And when I saw that data, I jumped up and did a dance. I think I did it on the Zoom. She can testify, because I'd never seen anything like that. I'd never seen anything where you as a patient advocacy group could go in, look at the data, look at the numbers, and put numbers to these stories that we're hearing. I think that's really important, is that patient advocacy groups don't have access to that. I mean, what you are providing to us is really empowering. And it's really important as we talk about policy, because when you go to Congress, you go to your members of Congress, you go to NCI, you go to the FDA, you go to all these agencies, they cry with you when they hear these stories. But ultimately they're saying, how prevalent is this? How widespread is this? Where is the data? What are the numbers? And you know, not all of us are as brilliant as Aswin, and we know that. I mean, we don't all have doctors on staff, PhDs on staff. So this data set really allowed us to look at it and empowered us to work with Komodo and say, hey, can we pull these numbers? How can we pull these numbers? What does this mean? Do you have Medicaid in there? Do you have Medicare in there? Where does the private insurance looking like? And I'll reference the study that Komodo published yesterday about the disparities within the Black community as it relates to diagnosis. Critically important to tell that story. What we hear from African American families across the country is that these are anecdotal stories that they're delayed treatment. That is so amazing that we're able to look at that study and say, no, this is not anecdotal. This is published data. This is claims data that's telling this story. And as soon as I saw it, I said, you know, the Congressional Black Caucus needs to hear it. And that's the power of advocacy, is being able to leverage the data that you all are producing, the studies that you all are producing, marry that with stories, and go to our members in Congress and say people are dying. And we know it. And look at these numbers. Not only are they dying, but they're dying at late stages for no reason. I think in JAMA, they recently reported that by 2030, colorectal cancer will be the #1 cancer killer for those between 20 and 49, which represents a lot of us. And our hope as an organization is that that won't be true. And if we can work with Komodo, our partners, and make that not true, that would just be, you know, the biggest win.
Can I? Just add something to that, because I think that was so well said. But I think advocates and patients have been fighting for a seat at the table. In so many of these, all these decisions are made for them, outside of them being involved. And I think one of the things that the data does is it gives advocacy a solid seat at the table. When we can bring the numbers, and when we can say, no, look, right here's what's happening, and here's how we know it. And it really helps us be critical in all of these decisions that patients, they want a voice, and you're really helping them have that.
I totally agree. It helps us prioritize our resources. I'm so sorry, I think we're going a little bit off script, but it helps us prioritize our resources, but I think it's super important for you guys to know like what you're doing day to day. And I think, you know, we have this opportunity to share with you and reflect back to you how important your work is, but like without it, we can't be as strong. Our voices can't be as strong. So really just want to thank you guys for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
One of the topics that you just raised is incredibly important around, you know, race and ethnicity and inclusion. And so maybe, Stacie, we'll start with you. Just, can you tell us a little bit around the disparities of care? You mentioned kind of in your opening story, like, if not me, then who?
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit around the stories and what we need to do as an industry to create access to care, close gaps in care, address disparities in care? And from a patient perspective, you know, how they look at the healthcare system differently when you come from a different background or come from, you know, the other side of the train tracks, proverbially.
Yeah, so one of the things we were talking at breakfast, you know, about some of the things that I'm passionate about, and this, not all this won't apply to you, but first of all, I'm really passionate about telehealth remaining as a permanent option in care. That absolutely has to stay. And if I can ask you to do anything in relation to policy, et cetera, it is to voice that this needs to remain as an option. For example, I advocate for patients that are right in the middle of a clinical trial that were receiving care across state lines, and part of maybe their decentralized clinical trial protocol was telehealth. I know a patient in particular that he lives in Connecticut. He was receiving care at Dana-Farber in Massachusetts. He is a very sick patient, and his telehealth care was cut off because of the pullback on telehealth. He is fighting for his life as a stage 4 cancer patient, okay? That's inhumane. Telehealth absolutely has to remain as an option. If you're in a very small town in Mississippi, nowhere near an NCI cancer center, how do you get that standard of care that I got, as, again, as a white privileged patient? But everybody should have the best chance to survive. And we need all the tools in our arsenal to help them do that, including telehealth. That's something, obviously, I'm totally passionate about. Again, another thing that we overlook is broadband access, okay? I mean, we're asking patients to access their medical records online, assuming that they have broadband access. They don't. Only 40% of patients access their patient portal. That means 60% have maybe never looked at a test result or their medication adherence plan or anything like that. And why is that? We need to drill down and find out why that is. So in terms of maximizing all of this technology, as Aswin said, we need to personalize this data, drilling down into race, ethnicity, and language data to personalize care. This one-size-fits-all approach is over. It's done. It has to be personalized. We talked last night about biomarker testing for increased individualized treatment of cancer and rare disease, all of that. So again, I'm obviously a call to action person, and so just keep pushing to drill down and find each individual patient, and knowing that your company is committed to reducing disease burden. Your competitors don't care, right? They're poaching data, they're just plucking and choosing everything, but the fact that you're all committed to the longitudinal life of a patient, you can go and start at the beginning of their journey and make it better for them all the way through.
And Stacie, you've shared with me many times that for the cholangiocarcinoma population, sometimes the standard of care is a trial. Can you talk to us? I know that you've spent a lot of time in the trial space over the last few years as a labor of love. Can you tell me a little bit around how what's improved, what's not, and how that impacts the patient?
Yeah, if I could just make one comment on what Stacie said. I think we have to identify the patient journey, these individual patient journeys, before we know what to do. I think everybody wants to help and everyone wants to do something, but what Komodo can do is actually map out these patient journeys for us so we know if they're being seen or if they aren't. We know, so we have the data. I think that's really critical. And then we can apply the data to pressure points in the regulatory areas and with Congress, those kinds of things. Clinical trials, I think, they say that 80% of patients are seen outside of the major academic centers. So there's sort of, if you talk about, the water getting to the end of the row in a garden, because I know Aswin's a gardener, that, somewhere in between here, right, between where you're being seen and an FDA approval is the academic centers, because they're the ones that are running the clinical trials. And then you do have a lot of community clinical trials, but the vast majority of our patients, over 50%, never even get offered a clinical trial. And a clinical trial, if you are a cholangiocarcinoma patient, it's part of your treatment pathway. It is part. Whether you have surgery, whether you've been on one clinical trial, you've got to map out kind of your A, B, C, D options. And so it's really important. Part of our work with Komodo has been reaching into community providers when we see that they've seen a cholangiocarcinoma patient and giving them information, about clinical trials, about biomarker testing, about all these important things that their patients need to know about. And we hope that it's not ageism. In our cancer, most patients are 65 and above, although we see those numbers shifting downward, just like I think in colorectal cancer. This is, in another 10 or 20 years, we're going to be looking at, 20, 30, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds getting these devastating cancers, when we really, this age population is not concerned about it. And I think we have to map all of this out and take a look so that we can address some of those issues.
And this is a question both for the entire group. When we think about care standards, Anjee, there's a very established standard of care. The adherence to that standard of care, in terms of diagnosis and testing, that's a different story. We'll talk about that. But Stacie, when you started, cholangiocarcinoma had really no established standard of care. And Anjee, you're probably seeing a shift in the standards of care. So can you talk a little bit around how patients' voices impact the standards of care? And secondly, how you've seen data changing the minds of practitioners in the context of what they do in the office with their patients every day?
I think our MSIH story is a great one as it relates to this. It was a small clinical trial that saw a very rapid response for MSI-high patients, and for colorectal cancer patients, that makes up about 6% of our patient population diagnosed with colorectal cancer. But it was amazing to see patients walk in or barely be able to walk in and then dance their way out, because we were able to identify a biomarker that helped us treat them, and we saw us unlock immunotherapy for colorectal cancer patients where we otherwise did not have an immunotherapy. That was a game changer for colorectal cancer. It really highlighted the importance of biomarker testing, not that we weren't testing before, but that there was this MSI-high patients had something very unique that we needed to pay attention to, and it was a young population that was being impacted. So these are our Lynch patients that are really have a lot to cover as it relates to their potential for high risk of cancer. Now, I will say, as it relates to how does that change practice, it's slow. We saw aggressive responses to MSI-high patients, and yet less than 60% of our community docs are using MSI-high testing the way that they should. And so that's, again, as you start thinking about the data and where we could do, is seeing those gaps. We hear it from patients, but when we were able to pull the numbers on biomarker testing and pull that report and really see it, I think that's when we said, this needs to be a much larger discussion, pulling in different partners. And around biomarker, we see us all partnering. So that's a pan-cancer issue. Biomarker testing is a roundtable discussion that all cancer groups are very concerned about. And as Stacie has stated, 80% of care is in community practices, and it's complex. There's revenue issues, there's insurance issues, there's just sort of the old guard, and they don't want to change their practice. And so being able to publish data around the lack of biomarker testing, I think, helps advocacy groups hold those physicians accountable.
Stacie, I know that you've been interested in alerting solutions for a while. Can you tell me a little bit around how you plan on using alerts in order to drive better education and adoption around some of the testing, diagnosis, and treatment paradigms in cholangiocarcinoma?
Yeah, we've been having this conversation for probably 3 years, so we're ready. We're ready, and kind of doing that in 2 ways. One is that we have a newly diagnosed portal that we developed that kind of takes patients through, it's kind of like a pathway, it takes them through a pathway. Here, you need to get biomarker testing, you need to have, there are just certain things that you need to do in this cancer to make sure that you've got the right treatment pathway. So the other end of that, so we're working with the patients, and Facebook and social media and Google AdWords, and you're doing all of that work. Okay, well, that's not where the physicians are looking. So we're having to go about it both ways, right? We're going to the patients and saying, hey, here's information that you can take to your oncologist. And on the other end, we're reaching out when we get these alerts of, here are all the community professionals who saw a cholangiocarcinoma patient in the last, block of time. And then we do the same thing. We have an email series, a kind of a welcome series that we send to them. And it's, and it takes them the same thing. Did you know? And here's some data, and here are some resources for you. And listen, we can help your patients we can connect them with a mentor. We can connect them with financial resources. We can connect them, there are just a lot of things that we can help them do, and we can get them connected in to get biomarker testing and all those things. So we're really looking at it both ways. And that program will start in the next couple of weeks with the physicians. So we've already had an enormous uptick in patients coming through that portal and getting the information. So we're hoping that we can really make an impact on educating community physicians or oncologists.
So Stacie, we've heard the story of FIGHT CRC, which is a more prevalent disease, standard of care in terms of cholangiocarcinoma, which is a rare disease. Your son has a disease that does not even have a name. So can you tell us a little bit around what is that like in terms of a caregiver experience?
Yeah, I feel really lucky to be up here with, obviously I'm a colorectal cancer survivor, and, I've worked with Anjee. She is brilliant, and the work that she's done, FIGHT CRC, is amazing. I've done work with them. I met Stacie today. My son has a rare disease, so we're kind of all in this together, and it's amazing. A couple things, but before I talk about that, just to springboard off what Stacie said, I don't know if you guys saw, there was a report in Startup Health. I saw it in 2019 and 2020, and it showed, VC investments across the tech space. Number one, which was awesome, was patient empowerment tools. And that was by far the biggest investment across those 2 years through COVID. The least was education and content. So great, we have all these patient empowerment tools. Bad, nobody knows how to use them. And nobody's educating the patients on how to use them. And that was, in my speaking, that was the one thing that I was all upset about. I was like, everybody's invested in these shiny new objects, through COVID, and tech went like this, but, does anybody know how to use it? Were people instructed how to use telehealth, and what was digital etiquette and digital literacy, and was that all done? So now is the time that we've come through COVID, and here we are 2 years later. Let's go back, as Stacie said, and let's educate our patients, round that out to tell them the power of this data, how they can use the data, how they can access their data, and how it can make their care better. That's critical, and we all need to be committed to that. Aswin, to answer your question, yeah, I'm making it up as I go along. I am literally, every day is an adventure. I have no idea. Being a caregiver is very hard, and we need to include caregivers completely in the patient experience. When you're a patient and you hear the words, "You have cancer," you hear nothing after that. I can tell you it happened to me. You hear nothing after that. And again, I worked in healthcare. I have 2 master's degrees and everything, and I just blanked out. So you need that additional voice. And if that additional voice is a combination of a caregiver, a care partner, and or technology, that needs to help this whole process and help understand that information. The other thing is, everything needs to be on an app. I wish that when I was going through my cancer treatment, that I had an app that could put me in touch with my care team to say, when I was so sick in bed and I could barely see and I was nauseous and everything, I wish that I had something. Everybody plays Wordle, right? Play Wordle, okay? I wish I had like a cancer Wordle that I could get up, and I was looking forward to it, and I could get on, "Stacie, how are you feeling today?" Terrible, okay? And then it would put me in touch with my care team, and somebody would reach out to me. So much happens in between the visits. I mean, the visits are episodic, but between remote patient monitoring and data capture and patient-reported outcomes, we need to capture everything that happens in the home and between those visits. And I don't know that at all answered your question, Aswin. But those are some of the things I wanted to say.
And I think we were actually chatting about this before we started this session. So much of the care journey is shaped by folks who are not the doctor.
Yes.
So there's nurse practitioners, there's medical assistants, there's even the front desk receptionist and their voice when you need to change something or you need to get in touch with someone. Can you all share a little bit around what that's like and how like there's specific allied health services is what we kind of call it, but how they shape the care system and how that kind of care team is the driving thrust around, a patient experience?
So I want to piggyback on something Stacie said before I answer that question. I promise I will. But I think there is one thing to keep in mind as we talk about health equity and we talk about sustainability, because we can learn from that, especially as we talk about tech companies coming into healthcare and building apps and building tools and patient empowerment efforts. One of the things in public health we've heard, and before it was health disparities, now it's health equity, is that you can't be a short-term effort. So one of the hardest things that we've done in public health is we're gonna grant this for 6 months and reach this pocket or subpopulation, and then we move on to a different shiny thing. Well, that community is left with whatever you started, and it's so challenging. So I just wanna add that if health equity is something that Komodo does tackle, that it is a long-term effort, because it is even harder to recover from something that is a short term and then a shiny thing and you move away from it. So as a patient, so I was diagnosed with cancer right at the beginning of COVID. So not as an organizational perspective, but as a patient, I know everything about cancer, I thought. But as soon as you hear those words, like Stacie had said, you kind of blank out, but you also become a number immediately. So I'm no longer Anjee Davis, president of Fight Colorectal Cancer, who's done all these things in cancer. I'm just Anjee Davis, patient number XYZ, sitting in the waiting room. And it is candidly terrible. I was diagnosed in a community practice, a rural community practice. My cancer was delayed, my diagnosis was delayed, and honestly, I had to fire my entire care team and say, you know what, you all aren't following NCCN guidelines, I'm so sorry, but we're not gonna be engaging anymore, and I'm gonna take my care somewhere else. That is not the norm. Most patients go in, they become a quick number, they're petrified, and they go with exactly who the doctor says they're gonna go to. They don't get to choose their specialist. They say, I'm gonna refer you to Dr. Joe. He's gonna see you. You don't look at their CV. You don't see, what their volume is. I'll be candid, I probably shouldn't say this. I did look at Komodo data on all my doctors. I was like, how are you doing, really? So, but you don't have that access. Most patients can't. And we want to provide that access to patients so that they can really be thinking about that. And it may not be the patient, maybe the caregiver. I love what Stacie said, that her entire family rallied around her brother and did the homework. And that is what happens for many families. You rally and you start going to the internet and you start looking up names and you start trying to figure out who the best is. You call your cousins, your brothers, who knows, anybody who's amazing that can get you to the doctor that can save your life. And so part of that journey for you all, I think, is helping us make that quick and fast and consistent for anyone, anywhere. And I think that's ultimately, all our goals, but I'll turn that over to you.
No. Was there another question? I'm sorry.
The journey oftentimes for patients, to your point, does not start with the provider. It starts usually online. So maybe I can get a sense from the group around, there's obviously information out there that's correct and accurate and actionable, and then there's information that's not. And so can you all speak a little bit to the frustrations of being a patient or for patients of finding misinformation online that could potentially damage or not lead them to the optimal outcome?
Yeah, what comes to mind for me, sorry, thank you. What comes to mind for me, is that helping?
Don't move.
Yeah, that's a big, anyone who Googles cholangiocarcinoma is going to just go home and get their things put together. And make sure all their affairs are in order. But what they don't realize if they don't go to a major academic center is they've probably not been diagnosed correctly, and that there are a lot of options. Right now, for cholangiocarcinoma patients, there are over 400 clinical trials. That's a lot for a rare cancer, and this is a community that's really pulled together to try and encourage industry to lower those barriers so industry can come in. I think one thing that we have talked about, but I think that would be super helpful, and one thing that we're looking at with Melissa and Paul, our team from Komodo, is those underlying autoimmune diseases that are precursors to cholangiocarcinoma so that we can get early detection. And even early detection in one segment kind of opens you up to early detection in other segments. And we just at GI ASCO, which is one of the big cancer meetings, had a readout for an immunotherapy that's working for cholangiocarcinoma. It's not quite like MSIH. We have about 1 to 3%, but it's a miracle for those patients. It's a miracle. And so if we can go to these early, the PSC partners is one of the partners that we introduced to Komodo. 20% of their patients turn into ours. And this is where a lot of our early detection efforts are going to be based, and we really need Komodo to help us with that data so that we can see that journey beforehand. We can see all those ICD codes that happen before they get a PSC diagnosis or before they get to cholangiocarcinoma, or what happens in between PSC and cholangiocarcinoma. We really need to map that out so that we can work on early detection efforts.
I wanted to get back to what you said, and we were talking about it at breakfast. As you can tell, I'm pretty outspoken, pretty opinionated, and I wear my heart on my sleeve.
Great advocate.
But I love my care team. My care team is why I'm still alive, in addition to my family and my friends and the support of Advocacy. But see, I'm getting emotional again. I hug and kiss my oncologist and I tell him, I love you. And he says, I love you too, Stacie. And he was invested in me and I was invested in him. I wanted to fight for him. And my nurse, I glob onto people. We had dinner last night. These guys are my best friends already. I just glob onto people. But my oncology nurse is now one of my best friends. And yesterday was her 50th birthday. And, I was here to see it and celebrate it. I was here to celebrate my 50th birthday, which I never thought I'd see. My son's graduating high school this year. I never thought I'd see that. So these relationships with our care team are critical. And technology should not replace those relationships. Mm-hmm. They should enhance them. Mm-hmm. And technology and data should be in the background as the additional member of the care team, making the whole patient experience better. It should not be a burden to the patient. It shouldn't be an extra thing we have to do. We're just trying to survive, okay, quite frankly. So everything else should be done in the background to make our care journey easier. So that was one thing that I want to say about your question. The other thing I want to say, and this might be the unpopular opinion, I'm going to take a risk, but patients need to know that you're using our data. And I'm going to liken it to if your best friend borrowed your car, right? It's okay. Your best friend needs to borrow your car. You just want to know, right? So we have a huge trust problem in this country right now. We know that. So the more that we can break that down and just be transparent at the beginning and say, look, we're capturing data on you. This is where we're using it. And even if you're selling it, that's fine. Just tell us. It's our data. It's our asset. It's very important to us. So just tell us that, how you're going to use it, and it's fine from there. I've got enough bad surprises in my life. Being told I had cancer, being told my son would never walk or talk. I don't need any more surprises to know that my data is going here, there. Just tell me. So it's just I got the stage, so I had to make a couple points. So.
Any other thoughts on data privacy?
David, no, well, I mean, I think it's privacy, but it's also that feedback loop that Stacie's talking about. And that's not just tech companies. I mean, that's NCI and all the agencies that use our data, all the PIs that collect data during clinical trials. It is something that I know we all advocate for is the feedback loop. Like, if the trial fails, we still want to know, like, why did it fail? And I think that if we're asking patients to take a very big risk and commit to a clinical trial, we owe it to them to tell them, how did it go? Did we learn anything? Because we learn through failure and through success. So,
Or how about thank you?
Thank you would be nice.
Thank you.
These are the pioneers. I mean, these people are paving the way for others, and they deserve to be treated special. They deserve to be valued. They deserve to be paid. They deserve to have all their travel expenses paid. Again, we need to find every single way to reduce the burden on the patient, whether that's through technology or incentivizing. That's what we need to do, for sure. I didn't mean to jump in there.
No, I think that's great. I mean, I completely agree. And I think that's one of the things that you said, like, it's a companion. So if we can use technology to provide that feedback, to provide that sort of thank you and gratitude for being a part of it and keep that connectiveness, I think it's something that we should struggle with and try to figure out if we can find answers. Because to date, we don't. There are a lot of patients, there are a lot of failed trials, there's a lot of data, and we keep hearing about data and the potential of data. I think I'm not gonna go on a tangent, but this is a really important time where we have an administration that's supporting cures. And so I think that we need to find a way to work together, to work with industry, to work with technologists, to work with advocacy, to work with patients, and to have a plan. I think going back to what you had talked about, for colorectal cancer, there wasn't a plan, like a path to a cure. And so, Fight Colorectal Cancer took time to outline it because ultimately you have to have a plan, but you have to have partners like Komodo to help actualize that. And so, this from a policy standpoint is extremely exciting times, and we just have to be very loud. We need 1,000 million Stacies to be loud on the Hill and remind them where they need to invest and where they need to prioritize, and the data helps sort of highlight where we can prioritize.
This theme of prioritization has come up a few times, and so given that we have a few folks that run now larger foundations, can you share a little bit around the hardest trade-offs that you've had to make in terms of priority investment over the last few years?
I can go first. I think we've had to really say no. We're a small group. We're not the biggest colorectal cancer group, nor do I want us to be the biggest colorectal cancer group. We are focused on research and education and a deep dive into colorectal cancer. Policy action is really where we're at, and what we've had to say no to is really important because we are not a catchment for all things colorectal cancer. And I think when we first started, we were like, oh gosh, we should do everything. And it was funny, I was just talking to Sharon, I said we've really pulled back and said, no, we need to do a very few things very well. And that's why we do invest in data. That's why we do invest our time and we hire people that are excited about that. Because I think if you try to be everything, sometimes you get nothing done. And I think that's really hard for advocacy groups because we want to save lives and we have patient stories and we're all criers and bleeders and we want to do as much as we can. But I think sometimes no is the most powerful thing we can do.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Unfortunately for us, we are the only foundation that supports cholangiocarcinoma in the US. And so we kind of have to do everything. Mm-hmm. I don't look at our nonprofit work as competitive because we partner with all, we partner all over the place. We have to get this work done. But I think one of our weakest points is one of Anjee's strongest, where we're we don't have the bandwidth to do a lot of deep policy work. And so we'll join with, Deadliest Cancer Coalition, these other coalitions who are doing that work, and we'll join in with them. And at some point, we'll have to do that if we're going to get real funding carved out of the DoD or the NCI for this cancer, which we hope to do. But those are heavy lifts. They're expensive. You've got to have, a lot of feet on the ground in those areas. And so we focus more on funding the basic research because we don't really know the mechanisms that are, projecting cholangiocarcinoma. And we don't know, there's so many things that we don't know. So we really have to, we're supporting patients, we're supporting research, we're supporting the clinicians, bringing these collaborations together. I do think one of the biggest weaknesses that advocacy has is, because we love the academics and we work with them, but these academic institutions that will not share data, I really hope that they could see, like Stacie said, this is the patient's data. And they need to share the data, but I think they look at it very differently than the advocacy groups do and the patients do. And that's a real hindrance to what these academics are trying to do because they want to collaborate and work together. It's just very difficult to get the data out of the institutions.
And once it's published, it's behind a paywall many times. So if you go to,
we can't even see the research that we fund. We can't see it.
I just want to springboard off of my colleagues here and say, first of all, in terms of priorities, Aswin, policy is the way that we're going to affect the greatest change on the greatest number of people. And these issues that we're talking about today, these are bipartisan issues. These are things that everybody should care about. Absolutely. Saving lives is a bipartisan issue. And so any policy that, should go to that effect. So that's number one. Number two is, we talked about this last night at dinner, we got to get these payers on board. And we got to get the payers understanding, even though they're episodic and a patient today is not their patient tomorrow, we have to somehow show them that behavioral change across the disease journey of a patient is going to reduce overall cost in the system. I don't know how we do that. I know you're all sitting there going, nice try, Stacie. But we're all, a part of that, and focusing just every day on that and pushing a little bit harder and showing them that it will make change. And I forgot my third point. That was it.
Maybe as a closing question, I would ask each of our panelists, if you could only have one wish fulfilled, so to speak, to power patient advocacy organizations, what would it be and why?
one wish.
Yes.
If I only had one wish, I would cure cancer. That would universally cure cancer, all cancers. That would be my wish. Why? Honestly, it's not even, it's devastating. Cancer is a devastating disease. It impacts more than the patient, impacts the entire family, impacts your work, it impacts your colleagues, it impacts all these people. I feel like cancer is one of those that, and you see the survivors and you see caregivers, but it's just so much bigger than that. And I think that, we as a country, if we can cure cancer, we can help the world. I'm a dreamer.
I'm going with her answer. But second, I would say, just to all the dragons out here, that I think, data, there's not one area that we're working in that data doesn't affect, or that it couldn't affect, and it couldn't affect in a more powerful way. So I think that the work that you're doing it's super important, and it powers our work, and can make our work so much more meaningful if we are working from a solid foundation of data. So I think what you're doing is really important, and I hope that that you have felt that from us, that we can't do work without partnerships and without collaborations, and you just have to remember that these nonprofit groups, the patients who have the cancer, are the ones who are supporting these groups. all of the burden of cancer is on these patients, right? Everything is on these patients, and anything that we can do to lift them a little bit and support them a little bit is immeasurable. So just wanted to say thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Well, geez, I got to come in strong here. This is going to be tough. So what they said, but you know, I'm a business person. I have a business background. So my wish would be, and if you want some fun, follow me on Twitter because I light people up. But calling out BS for people who say that they are committed to the patient experience and they have no idea what the patient experience is. Thank you. You know, Komodo has a great asset in Sharon, and your commitment to understanding the patient journey, that empathy is unheard of. You are setting the standard for how a company, industry should approach healthcare because you have a patient as an executive. Everybody should have that. Every patient experience department, et cetera, should have a patient in that C-suite or on that executive team. Every patient experience panel should have a patient. Every patient engagement discussion should have a patient. So again, thank you for what you do. Thank you for walking the walk. So many companies talk the talk. I'm calling them all out, and you are walking the walk. So thank you for what you do.